The diner had been open for 43 years, long enough for its cracked vinyl booths and humming coffee machine to become part of the town's muscle memory. On weekday mornings, nothing ever changed. The same retirees by the window, the same waitress pouring refills before anyone asked. The same quiet rhythm that made people believe nothing truly bad could happen there. That illusion shattered the moment the police cruiser stopped outside and the door swung open with more force than necessary. The officer entered already tense, his jaw tight, his hand brushing his belt as if the room itself had challenged him. Conversations softened but didn't stop. This was his town. Everyone knew that. His eyes scanned the diner, passing familiar faces, settling on a man seated alone near the back. The man wasn't doing anything wrong. He wasn't loud. He wasn't defiant. He was simply there, drinking coffee, posture straight, movements controlled, eyes alert in a way most people didn't notice until it was too late. The exchange began quietly. A question, a response, then a sharper tone. Chairs shifted. Someone looked up from their plate. And in a single, uncontrolled instant, the officer's restraint failed. His fist connected with the man's face, a sharp, brutal sound that cut through the diner like a gunshot. Silence followed, thick and stunned. No one screamed. No one moved. Everyone understood the same thing at once. This wasn't just a punch. It was a mistake whose consequences hadn't even begun to surface. Daniel Brooks had chosen the diner for its anonymity. No televisions blaring, no crowds, just enough noise to blend into, just enough routine to disappear inside. He sat with his back to the wall out of habit, not fear. The habit had been trained into him years ago, reinforced in places far less forgiving than a Midwestern breakfast counter. He knew where the exits were. He knew who was watching him. He also knew how not to be noticed. He dressed plainly, dark jacket, neutral colors, nothing that invited attention. His movements were economical, deliberate. When he lifted his coffee mug, he did so with the same controlled motion every time. It wasn't a performance, it was discipline. He had learned long ago that calm was a form of protection. The officer, Frank Miller, had not slept well the night before. 2 calls back to back, one domestic, one traffic stop that had turned verbal and ugly. His patience was thin, his tolerance for anything that felt like disrespect thinner still. He was used to rooms shifting when he entered, used to compliance without explanation. Authority to him wasn't something to justify, it was something to enforce. When he noticed Brooks, something about the man unsettled him. Not aggression, not arrogance, it was the absence of both. Miller asked a question that didn't need to be asked, issued a directive that served no purpose beyond control. Brooks looked up, met his eyes, and responded calmly. No raised voice, no sarcasm, just a question of clarification. That was enough. Miller heard defiance where there was none. He heard challenge. In his mind, the situation narrowed to a simple equation: submit or be corrected. Brooks didn't argue. He didn't comply instantly either. He paused, considering the words, considering the tone. That pause, barely a second long, felt like an eternity to a man whose authority depended on immediacy. The escalation happened faster than anyone expected. Miller stepped closer, voice rising, body language tightening. Brooks remained still, hands visible, posture open. The diner held its breath, and then Miller's fist flew, driven by impulse rather than procedure, striking Brooks across the cheek with enough force to stagger him. Brooks absorbed the blow without falling. He didn't raise his hands. He didn't strike back. He felt the familiar shock of impact, the sharp bloom of pain, and beneath it, something colder and more focused. He tasted blood and swallowed it. Years of training surged forward, overriding instinct. Reacting would only serve the man who had hit him. Enduring would serve the truth. The room froze. A fork clattered to the floor. A waitress stood rigid, her hands still wrapped around a coffee pot. Someone halfway raised a phone, then hesitated. Miller's expression shifted almost immediately. The flash of anger gave way to calculation. His voice dropped into the tone he used on reports. Resisting, he said loudly for the room to hear, "Failure to comply." Brooks nodded once, slow and deliberate. "I'm not resisting," he said evenly. "I'm standing." The words only aggravated Miller further, but the presence of witnesses forced restraint back into place. Orders were barked. Hands were placed on Brooks's arms, rough but not brutal. Brooks complied with each instruction, his movements careful, his expression unreadable. He knew the moment had already passed. What mattered now was what came next. After a tense few minutes, Miller released him with a warning, loud enough to reassert control, vague enough to leave options open. Brooks straightened his jacket, wiped the blood from his lip with a napkin offered by a trembling waitress, and thanked her quietly. He paid for his coffee. He did not look back at the officer. When Brooks stepped outside, the morning air felt sharper. His reflection in the diner's glass showed a man composed, eyes steady, jaw set. Inside, Miller watched him leave, convincing himself the situation was handled. Around him, the diner slowly returned to motion, though the comfort it once offered was gone. As Brooks walked down the sidewalk, he felt the weight of what had begun settle in his chest. This was no longer about a punch. It was about a line crossed in public, with witnesses, with records soon to be written. He knew the system would move first. He also knew that restraint was not weakness. It was preparation. Behind him in the diner, conversations resumed in whispers. A waitress stared at her shaking hands. A customer replayed the moment over and over, wondering whether they should have done more. And at a corner table, a man who had seen this pattern before sat very still, his expression grim. The punch was over. The consequences were just beginning. The official report was written before the bruising on Daniel Brooks's face had fully darkened. Frank Miller sat at his desk with the practiced ease of a man who had done this many times before, fingers moving quickly, confidently, shaping the morning into something clean and defensible. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as he chose his words with care, not lying outright, just bending the truth until it pointed where he needed it to go. Subject appeared agitated. Subject questioned lawful instruction. Subject displayed non-compliant behavior. The phrases came easily, stacked one after another, each one blunting the edge of what had actually happened. The punch became an attempted restraint. The moment of silence in the diner became verbal escalation. Miller leaned back, reread the paragraph, and nodded. It would hold. It always did. By the time Brooks arrived home, the report had already been logged. He rinsed his mouth at the kitchen sink, watching diluted red spiral down the drain. The cut inside his cheek wasn't deep, but it throbbed dully, a constant reminder. He pressed an ice pack to his face and sat at the small table by the window, letting the cold seep in. Outside, the neighborhood moved on as if nothing had happened. A delivery truck idled. A dog barked. Life continued. His phone buzzed once. A message from an unfamiliar number. "Just checking if you're okay." It was the waitress from the diner. He stared at the screen for a moment before replying, "I'm fine, thank you. Be careful." He didn't add anything else. He didn't ask questions. He knew better than to draw lines too early. An hour later, a knock came at his door. 2 officers stood outside, not Miller, but uniforms he didn't recognize. Their posture was neutral, their tone professional. They asked if he would answer a few questions to clear things up. Brooks agreed. He invited them in, sat where they could see his hands, answered plainly. He described the sequence of events without embellishment, without accusation. When one of them mentioned resistance, Brooks calmly corrected him. When they asked if he wanted to press charges, Brooks said he needed time. They exchanged a look that lasted half a second too long. After they left, Brooks sat in the quiet and let the implications settle. The questions hadn't been about understanding. They'd been about framing. He knew what the next step would be. He had seen it before, in other forms, other jurisdictions. Silence would be interpreted as guilt. Speaking too soon would be spun as aggression. That evening, he requested a copy of the incident report through the department's online portal. When it arrived the next morning, he read it slowly, line by line. The language was precise, clinical, and deeply misleading. His calm response was described as argumentative. His pause was described as refusal. The punch wasn't mentioned at all. Instead, there was a vague reference to physical contact during an attempt to control the situation. Brooks closed the document and exhaled through his nose. The report wasn't sloppy. It was intentional. Across town, Miller leaned back in his chair as the shift changed. He joked with another officer, complained about paperwork, laughed when someone mentioned the diner. To him, the incident was already receding into the background noise of the job. The man hadn't filed a complaint yet. That was a good sign. Most didn't. And if he did, well, the report was already in place. Later that day, witnesses began receiving calls. The first was a man in his 60s who had been sitting near the window. An officer asked if he'd seen anything unusual. The man hesitated, then said it all happened so fast he wasn't sure. That answer was accepted with relief. The second call went to a young couple who'd been halfway through breakfast when the punch landed. They were reminded how stressful police work could be, how easy it was to misinterpret a tense situation. They agreed they didn't want to get involved. The waitress was called last. She sat in the manager's office with her hands folded in her lap, nodding as the questions were asked. Had the customer been loud? Did he seem aggressive? Was the officer just trying to maintain order? She answered carefully, her voice barely above a whisper. No, yes, maybe. When it was over, she went back to the floor and spilled coffee on a table she'd cleaned 1,000 times before. That night, Brooks drove to a quiet parking lot on the edge of town and made a call from his car. He spoke to a man he trusted, not a lawyer, not yet, but someone who understood systems and consequences. He explained what had happened, the report, the interviews. There was a pause on the other end of the line. You did the right thing by staying calm, the man said finally, but understand this. They're already writing the ending. If you do nothing, that version becomes the truth. Brooks thanked him and hung up. He sat in the dark for several minutes, hands resting on the steering wheel, mind moving through possibilities. He didn't want attention. He didn't want headlines. He wanted fairness. He wanted accuracy. He wanted the record to reflect reality. The next morning, he filed a formal complaint. The process was polite and impersonal. Forms were submitted. A confirmation number was issued. He was told someone would be in touch. Days passed, then a week. When he followed up, he was informed the matter was under internal review. He recognized the phrase for what it was: a pause, a delay, a way to let momentum die. Subtle changes followed. A cruiser passed his house more often than necessary. A neighbor mentioned officers asking questions about him. At the grocery store, a man he'd never met stared a little too long. Brooks adjusted his routines, not out of fear, but awareness. He documented everything: dates, times, small details most people ignored. Late one afternoon, an envelope appeared in his mailbox. Inside was a notice acknowledging receipt of his complaint and informing him that no immediate action was warranted based on the information provided. Brooks folded the paper carefully and placed it in a folder he had labeled simply, Morning Incident. He understood now. The punch had been the spark, but the real conflict was unfolding elsewhere, in offices and inboxes, in carefully chosen words and quiet phone calls. The system was doing what it always did when challenged. It was closing ranks. And Brooks knew that if this was going to change, silence was no longer an option. Daniel Brooks woke before dawn, the way he always did, long before the town stirred and traffic began to hum. The bruise along his cheek had deepened overnight, a muted purple spreading beneath his skin, but the pain was manageable. Pain, he had learned, was information, not a command. He moved quietly through the house, lacing his shoes, checking the locks, stepping outside while the air was still cool and empty. He ran the same route he had memorized in his first week here, a loop that took him past quiet homes and trimmed hedges, past a school playground still dark and abandoned. His breathing was steady, his pace even. Each step grounded him. This was how he kept order when the world around him became unpredictable. As he ran, his mind replayed the diner in fragments, not the punch itself, but the moments before and after. The tone of the officer's voice, the way the room had gone still, the speed with which the narrative had shifted once authority was challenged. He wasn't surprised by any of it. He had seen versions of this pattern before, just wearing different uniforms. Back home, he showered, dressed, and sat at the kitchen table with a notebook. He wrote nothing dramatic, just dates, times, names, small observations. The cruiser that passed his house twice in an hour, the unanswered email, the phrasing in the report that reappeared in later conversations. Documentation was a discipline of its own. By mid-morning, his phone buzzed with a number he recognized. It was his reserve unit coordinator. The tone was friendly, professional, careful. They had received notice of a civilian complaint involving Brooks's name. Nothing formal yet, just an inquiry. Brooks explained the situation in plain terms, sticking to facts, avoiding emotion. He was reminded of his obligations, the importance of discretion, the boundaries he could not cross. "I understand," Brooks said, and he did. When the call ended, he sat for a long moment staring at the wall. He had walked a careful line his entire career, balancing service with silence. Being active reserve meant he still carried responsibility, even here, even now. It also meant he could not speak freely, could not defend himself publicly without triggering consequences far beyond this town. That afternoon, as he drove to the grocery store, he noticed the same cruiser from earlier idling at the corner. The officer inside didn't look at him directly, but Brooks felt the weight of the presence. It wasn't surveillance in any official sense, it was a reminder. "We see you." Inside the store, a man bumped into him with exaggerated force and muttered an apology that didn't sound sincere. Brooks nodded and kept moving. He felt eyes on him in the aisles, curiosity mixed with something sharper. Rumors traveled fast in small towns, especially when fed quietly by authority. He checked his phone while waiting in line. A local news blog had posted a short item about a minor altercation at the diner, quoting police sources. No names were mentioned, but the framing was clear. An officer had been forced to intervene with an uncooperative patron. Brooks closed the page without reading the comments. That evening, he sat on his porch as the sun dipped low, the street bathed in orange light. A pickup slowed as it passed his house. Someone stared out the window. Brooks returned the look calmly until the truck moved on. He didn't feel anger. He felt calculation. Each small interaction was another data point, another indication of how the story was spreading. Later, he opened a locked drawer in his study and removed a slim folder. Inside were documents he rarely needed to look at, reminders of a life most people never saw. Orders, evaluations, clearances, proof of service that carried weight far beyond local jurisdiction. He didn't open them. He didn't need to. He only needed to know they were there. The next day, Miller drove past Brooks's house twice before noon. The first time he slowed. The second time he stopped briefly at the curb, then continued on. Brooks watched from behind the curtain, his expression unchanged. The intimidation was subtle, almost deniable, but unmistakable. Miller wasn't worried yet. He was testing. In the afternoon, Brooks received another call, this one from the department. A follow-up interview had been scheduled. Routine, they said. Brooks agreed to attend. He prepared carefully, reviewing his notes, reminding himself of the objective. This was not about winning an argument. It was about preserving truth until it could be heard. At the station, the questions circled familiar ground. Had he felt threatened? Did he raise his voice? Why hadn't he complied immediately? Brooks answered each one patiently. He corrected inaccuracies without accusation. When asked why he hadn't reacted to the punch, he paused. "I was trained not to escalate," he said simply. The room went quiet for a moment. The officers exchanged glances, uncertain how to place that answer. Brooks said nothing more. He didn't explain the training. He didn't name the institution. He let the ambiguity hang. When he left the station, he felt the shift. The tone had changed, just slightly. Curiosity had replaced confidence. Not fear, not yet, but awareness. They sensed there was more to him than the report suggested. That night, Brooks sat alone in his living room, the house dark except for a single lamp. He replayed the day's conversations, the looks, the pauses. He understood now that his calm wasn't disarming the situation, it was provoking it. To men like Miller, restraint looked like concealment, and concealment invited digging. Brooks wasn't hiding, he was waiting. He knew the next phase would be harder. The system would press, trying to force a reaction, trying to flush out whatever they suspected he was keeping to himself. He also knew that every step they took would leave marks of its own. The punch had exposed their temper. The report had exposed their strategy. What came next would expose their limits. Brooks turned off the light and went to bed, fully aware that the quiet he felt was temporary. The question was no longer whether the truth would surface, but how much pressure the system would apply before it did. The complaint disappeared into the system the way Brooks had expected it to. Not erased, not rejected, just slowed until it lost its shape. When he logged into the portal, the status remained unchanged. Under review. No name attached, no timeline, no indication that a human being had even read it. He called the number listed at the bottom of the confirmation email and reached a polite administrator who spoke in careful, neutral phrases. Internal affairs was backlogged. These things took time. He would be notified if further information was required. Brooks thanked her and ended the call. He had heard variations of the same explanation in other contexts, other institutions. Delay was a language of its own. At the station, the tone toward him shifted from curiosity to quiet irritation. He noticed it immediately when he arrived for a scheduled follow-up interview. The officer at the front desk avoided eye contact, sliding his visitor badge across the counter without a word. Down the hall, conversations paused as he passed, then resumed at a lower volume. He wasn't being confronted. He was being isolated. The interview itself was brief and procedural. The questions were narrower now, focused less on the incident and more on Brooks himself. How long had he lived in town? Where did he work? Did he have prior interactions with law enforcement? Each answer was noted, typed, filed away. The punch was barely mentioned. When Brooks asked about the status of his complaint, the detective leaned back in his chair and sighed. "These things rarely go the way people expect," he said, not unkindly. "Sometimes it's better to let them rest." Brooks met his gaze. "I'm not looking for a particular outcome," he said. "I'm looking for accuracy." The detective nodded, but the look in his eyes said the conversation was over. Outside the station, Brooks paused for a moment before getting into his car. The building looked the same as it always had, brick and glass, an emblem of order. But he could feel the shift now, the subtle pressure beginning to form. The system wasn't pushing back hard. It didn't need to. It relied on fatigue, on discouragement, on the quiet understanding that resistance came at a cost. That cost began to surface in small, almost reasonable ways. A letter arrived informing Brooks that his complaint had been reassigned due to a conflict of availability. Another email requested clarification on a detail he had already provided. When he responded, the reply took days. Each exchange was civil. Each one moved the process nowhere. At the diner, the waitress who had messaged him stopped responding. When Brooks returned one morning, hoping to speak to her, the manager told him she was no longer on the schedule. "Performance issues," he said quickly, eyes darting away. Brooks didn't press. He had seen this tactic before, too. Remove the witness, then deny the motive. Later that week, a man approached Brooks in the parking lot outside a hardware store. He introduced himself as a patrol officer, off-duty, just stopping by to say hello. He mentioned the diner, the misunderstanding, how things could get blown out of proportion. His tone was conversational, almost friendly, but the message beneath it was clear. Don't turn this into something it doesn't need to be. Brooks listened, nodded once, and walked away. That evening, Brooks reviewed public records online, searching for patterns rather than proof. It didn't take long to find them. Complaints filed against Officer Miller over the past decade. Excessive force. Improper conduct. None sustained. Each one dismissed after internal review. Each one followed by a similar phrase. Insufficient evidence. He printed the records and placed them in his growing folder. The next day, he was approached by a uniformed officer while filling his car at the gas station. This one didn't speak. He simply stood a few feet away, watching. Brooks met his gaze calmly, finished pumping, and left. The presence was intentional. So was the silence. At home, Brooks adjusted his routines further. Different times, different routes. He wasn't afraid, but he was alert. He logged every encounter, every cruiser sighting, every conversation that felt slightly off. The picture forming was no longer about Miller alone. It was about protection, about insulation, about a department that treated accountability as a threat rather than a responsibility. One afternoon, Brooks received a call from an unfamiliar number. The voice on the other end was low, cautious. A junior officer, he said, speaking unofficially. He'd heard about the complaint. He'd seen similar cases before. They didn't end well for the complainant. "I'm not telling you to drop it," the officer said quickly. "I'm just telling you how this usually goes." Brooks thanked him and ended the call. The warning was genuine. That made it more unsettling. By the end of the week, Brooks understood the shape of the resistance he was facing. It wasn't overt hostility, it was attrition. Every step forward required 3 more just to stay in place. Every ally was quietly removed or discouraged. Every document was filtered through layers designed to blur responsibility. The wall wasn't built all at once. It was assembled brick by brick, each one small enough to deny, strong enough to hold. That night, Brooks sat at his desk, the folder open in front of him. Reports, emails, notes, patterns. He traced the connections slowly, methodically, feeling the weight of the decision ahead. Continuing meant escalation. It meant drawing attention he had spent years avoiding. It meant inviting scrutiny into parts of his life he had kept compartmentalized for good reason. But stopping now meant something else entirely. It meant allowing the record to stand as written. It meant accepting that the punch had been justified on paper, that the silence of witnesses had been coerced into consent. It meant becoming another line item in a system designed to forget. Brooks closed the folder and leaned back in his chair. He didn't feel anger. He felt clarity. This was no longer a dispute between a man and an officer. It was a confrontation with a structure that relied on people giving up. Brooks had no intention of doing that. As he turned off the light and prepared for bed, he understood something with certainty. The wall had been revealed. The next step would not be to push against it blindly, but to find the cracks that had already formed, hidden beneath years of pressure and neglect. And when those cracks widened, the wall would not fall quietly. Brooks met the man on a Tuesday morning at a diner 2 towns over, the kind of place that still served breakfast all day and didn't ask questions. The location wasn't accidental. It was far enough away to avoid familiar faces, close enough to feel ordinary. Brooks arrived early and took a seat by the window, back to the wall, coffee untouched. The man who entered 10 minutes later moved with a stiffness that came from old injuries rather than age. He wore a faded jacket, the collar turned up against the chill, and carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone who had once been in charge and no longer needed to prove it. He scanned the room briefly before spotting Brooks and nodding once, a gesture of recognition that carried no warmth and no suspicion. "You picked a smart place," the man said as he slid into the booth across from him. "So did you," Brooks replied. The man introduced himself as Thomas Hale, retired law enforcement, 28 years on the job, the last 5 as a deputy chief in a neighboring county. He said it plainly, without embellishment, as if listing facts rather than credentials. Brooks listened without interrupting. "I heard about what happened," Hale continued. "Not from the paper. From someone who still talks to me when they shouldn't." Brooks nodded. "Stories travel." "They do. Especially when the report doesn't match the behavior." That caught Brooks's attention. He studied Hale's face more closely now, noting the lines around his eyes, the way his gaze never quite settled, always moving just enough to stay aware. "I didn't come here to tell you what to do," Hale said. "I came because I've seen this before. Different names, same playbook." Hale sipped his coffee and leaned back. He talked about internal reviews that went nowhere, about officers protected by silence and paperwork, about careers ended not by wrongdoing, but by refusing to look away. He didn't speak with bitterness. He spoke with familiarity. "They'll try to tire you out," Hale said. "They'll isolate you, make you feel unreasonable. If that doesn't work, they'll look for leverage, something to shift the focus away from what actually happened." Brooks didn't ask how Hale knew all this. The answer was written into the pauses between his words. "Why did you leave?" Brooks asked. Hale smiled faintly. "I didn't. I was encouraged, reassigned, sidelined, until retirement looked like the only option that didn't end with me being blamed for someone else's mess." There it was, the motive Brooks had been waiting for. Not revenge, not heroism, recognition. "I'm not interested in a public fight," Brooks said. "I want accuracy. I want the record corrected." Hale nodded. "Then you're going to need patience and documentation, a lot of it." They talked for nearly an hour, keeping their voices low, letting the din of the diner swallow their conversation. Hale explained how to request records without triggering alarms, how to cross-reference reports for inconsistencies, how to preserve evidence without tipping off the department that someone was paying attention. He spoke in practical terms, like a craftsman explaining tools. Before they parted, Hale slid a folded piece of paper across the table. "Names, dates, file numbers, public access," he said. "For now." Brooks thanked him. Hale waved it off. "Just don't make the mistake of thinking this ends quickly," he said. "It rarely does." Over the next few weeks, their communication was sparse but deliberate. Hale never called from the same number twice. He never met Brooks in the same place. They shared documents through secure channels, each piece adding texture to a picture Brooks had already begun to see. The complaints against Miller stretched back further than Brooks had initially found. Not all of them involved physical force. Some were about tone, about unnecessary escalation, about encounters that left people shaken but unsure how to articulate why. Every complaint ended the same way: unsubstantiated, insufficient evidence, no further action. Hale pointed out the patterns Brooks might have missed. Similar language in reports, the same supervisors signing off, the same delays. It wasn't just one officer being protected, it was a habit. As the file grew, so did the pressure. Brooks received a notice from his reserve unit requesting a review of his current status. Nothing accusatory, just procedural. The timing wasn't lost on him. He responded promptly, providing what was required, nothing more. Still, the implication was clear. This situation had reached beyond local inconvenience. At home, the atmosphere shifted. Neighbors who had once waved now avoided eye contact. A package left on his porch was torn open, nothing missing, just disturbed enough to send a message. Brooks documented it all, his notebook filling with dates and times, the mundane details of intimidation. One evening, Hale called unexpectedly. "They're starting to feel cornered," he said. "That's when mistakes happen." "What kind of mistakes?" Brooks asked. "The kind that turn administrative issues into legal ones." The warning proved prescient. 2 days later, Brooks was served with a notice alleging he had failed to comply with a lawful order during the diner incident. The charge was minor, almost laughable, but it shifted the narrative. Now there were two sides. Now there was an argument to be had. Brooks forwarded the notice to Hale without comment. "They're fishing," Hale replied, "and they're sloppy." Together they reviewed the language of the charge against the original report. The discrepancies were subtle but undeniable. Dates didn't align, descriptions conflicted, a timeline that couldn't be reconciled without acknowledging the punch. "This is good," Hale said, for the first time allowing himself a hint of satisfaction. "They're contradicting themselves." But the cost was mounting. Brooks's sleep grew lighter. His phone buzzed with unknown numbers at odd hours. He declined interviews he knew would be framed against him. He stayed disciplined, but the strain showed in the quiet moments, the pauses that lingered a second too long. One night, Brooks sat alone at his desk, the folder spread before him. He thought about the life he had chosen, the anonymity he had worked so hard to maintain. He thought about the ease of walking away, of letting the system reset and move on. And then he thought about the punch, about the silence that followed, about the record that would stand unchallenged if he stopped now. Hale's voice echoed in his mind. If you don't hold the line moves. Brooks closed the folder and locked it away. He wasn't chasing vindication, he was preserving truth. The alliance he had formed wasn't about winning, it was about endurance. The man who had left the system had come back to confront it, not with force, but with memory and method. And Brooks, for the first time since the diner, felt something settle into place. This wasn't a solitary fight anymore. The pressure did not arrive all at once. It seeped in through the edges of Brooks's life, quiet and persistent, until it became impossible to ignore. The first sign was the email from his reserve command, formally requesting clarification regarding his ongoing civilian legal involvement. The wording was neutral, almost apologetic, but Brooks understood what it meant. His situation was no longer contained. He responded the same way he handled everything else, promptly and precisely. He outlined the facts, attached documentation, and avoided speculation. Still, the reply that came back 2 days later made it clear the matter would be reviewed further. Until then, certain duties would be paused, training schedules postponed, advisory work reassigned. Nothing permanent, they assured him, just temporary. Temporary had a way of becoming something else. The loss of routine unsettled him more than he expected. The structure of his days had always been his anchor, the thing that kept his thoughts ordered. Without it, time stretched in uncomfortable ways. He filled the hours with physical training, long walks, and paperwork, but the absence of purpose weighed on him. At home, the tension was palpable. His sister called more often, her concern thinly veiled behind casual conversation. She asked about the bruise that had faded but not disappeared entirely. She asked about the police cars she'd heard neighbors mention. Brooks reassured her, choosing his words carefully, but he could hear the strain in her voice. "This isn't what you signed up for," she said once quietly. "No," Brooks replied, "but it's part of it." Socially, the town had begun to close in on itself. Invitations stopped coming. Conversations ended quickly when he entered a room. At the post office, a man he'd spoken to dozens of times before pretended not to see him. The message was subtle but unmistakable. He was now a problem. Problems were best avoided. One afternoon, as Brooks returned from a run, he noticed his mailbox hanging slightly open. Inside, everything appeared intact, but the mail was out of order, envelopes shuffled. It wasn't theft. It was intrusion. He photographed it, logged it, and moved on, but the violation lingered. That evening, Hale called. "They're escalating without realizing it," he said. "That's dangerous for them." "For me too," Brooks replied. "Yes, but mostly for them." Hale explained that he'd pulled additional records, ones that required patience and persistence. Complaints filed by civilians who never followed up. Internal memos discussing optics rather than conduct. Notes about community trust used to justify inaction. None of it was explosive on its own. Together, it formed a pattern that couldn't be ignored. "They don't think you'll last," Hale said. "They think you'll decide this isn't worth it." Brooks didn't answer immediately. He had been asking himself the same question. The next blow came unexpectedly. Brooks received notice that the waitress from the diner had been terminated. The reason given was poor performance. Brooks knew better. He also knew reaching out to her now could do more harm than good. She had already paid a price for being in the room. That night, Brooks sat alone in his living room, the house quiet except for the ticking of the clock. He stared at the wall, replaying conversations, weighing consequences. Every step forward seemed to pull something else apart. His work, his privacy, his family's peace. For the first time since the diner, doubt crept in. What if Hale was wrong? What if the system didn't crack no matter how much pressure was applied? What if all this effort only resulted in a footnote, a closed case, another file marked unresolved? He imagined walking away, filing one last response, accepting the department's version of events, letting time smooth the edges. The town would forget. The pressure would ease. His duties would eventually resume. Life would normalize. The thought made his chest tighten. He thought of the punch, not the pain, but the moment after. The silence. The collective understanding in the room that something had gone wrong. He thought of the waitress's trembling hands, of the witnesses who had looked away, of the report that transformed violence into procedure. If he walked away now, that version would stand unchallenged. It would become the record others would rely on. It would justify the next punch, and the one after that. Brooks reached for his notebook and opened it to the first page. He reread the earliest entry, written in steady handwriting, detailing the morning of the incident. He remembered how clear everything had felt then, how certain he had been about what mattered. The cost was real. He didn't deny it. He was paying it in isolation, in uncertainty, in the slow erosion of the life he had built. But the alternative carried a cost too, one he wasn't willing to bear. The next morning, Brooks contacted Hale and told him he was ready to proceed fully. No half measures. No retreat. Hale listened quietly. "Once we do this," he said, "there's no going back." "I know," Brooks replied. "I've known that for a while." They outlined the next steps carefully. Requests for additional records. Formal inquiries that would trigger mandatory responses. A timeline designed to force the system to react rather than wait. Everything would be documented. Everything would be verifiable. As Brooks hung up the phone, he felt a strange calm settle over him. The uncertainty hadn't disappeared, but it had clarified. The path forward was difficult, but it was defined. He could work with that. Later that day, a cruiser passed his house again, slower than usual. Brooks watched from the window, his expression unchanged. The intimidation no longer felt abstract, it felt desperate. He went back to his desk and began organizing the files, labeling folders, cross-referencing dates. Each action was deliberate, purposeful. He wasn't trying to overwhelm the system, he was preparing to withstand it. The price of silence had been heavy. The price of speaking would be heavier. But Brooks understood something the system had underestimated. He had endured worse than this, in places where there were no rules to appeal to and no records to correct. He had learned that pressure, when met with discipline, eventually revealed its source. Whatever came next, he would face it head-on, not with anger, but with resolve. The response from the federal office arrived without ceremony, a single-page acknowledgement sent through secure email. It confirmed receipt of the civil rights complaint and explained in measured language that the matter would undergo preliminary review. No promises, no timelines, just process. Brooks read it twice, then filed it carefully. He had not expected more. Federal attention, he knew, did not announce itself loudly. What changed first was the behavior of the local department. Miller stopped driving past Brooks's house so openly. The cruiser no longer idled at the corner. Instead, different vehicles appeared at irregular intervals, never lingering long enough to be obvious. The pressure became less visible and more probing, as if someone were testing the perimeter without leaving fingerprints. At the station, confidence gave way to carelessness. Hale noticed it before Brooks did. In a late-night call, he pointed out a discrepancy in a supplemental report the department had quietly filed. The document attempted to reinforce the original narrative, but it contradicted a timestamp from a dispatch log Hale had obtained through public records. "They're patching holes," Hale said, "and they're rushing." Brooks compared the files side by side, tracing the mismatch with his finger. It wasn't dramatic, but it was undeniable. A small error, the kind that only appeared when too many hands tried to fix a story after the fact. Meanwhile, the officer involved seemed to grow restless. Miller's demeanor shifted in public spaces. He spoke louder, laughed harder, asserted himself where it wasn't necessary. At a town council meeting, he made a pointed comment about people who invite trouble and then cry about consequences. The remark drew scattered applause. Brooks watched the clip later and felt no anger, only confirmation. Overconfidence was setting in. The department issued a brief statement to a local outlet, reiterating its trust in internal procedures and dismissing external complaints as premature. The tone was firm but defensive. a subtle shift from quiet dismissal to public reassurance. Brooks recognized it as the midpoint of a familiar arc. When institutions felt watched, they performed certainty. Hale dug deeper. Through a retired clerk who still had access to archived indices, he uncovered an internal memo circulated years earlier. It outlined strategies for minimizing exposure in cases involving use of force. The language was sanitized, framed as risk management, but the intent was clear. Control the narrative early, isolate witnesses, delay formal review. Brooks read the memo slowly, absorbing the weight of what it represented. This wasn't improvisation, it was policy. The Federal Review remained silent. Weeks passed without word. Brooks returned to a disciplined routine, careful not to let anticipation dictate his actions. He trained, he documented, he avoided unnecessary contact. Each day felt like a test of endurance rather than momentum. Then came the mistake. A young officer, new to the department, stopped Brooks one afternoon for a minor traffic issue. The interaction was polite at first, almost rehearsed. When Brooks asked for clarification about the reason for the stop, the officer hesitated, then cited a regulation that didn't apply. Brooks noted the time, the badge number, the wording. 2 hours later, Brooks received a voicemail from the department, asking him to come in to resolve a discrepancy. Hale's response was immediate. Do not go alone. They met instead at a neutral location, and Hale listened as Brooks described the stop in detail. Hale pulled up the regulations cited and shook his head. This is sloppy, he said, and it's documented now. The stop itself wasn't illegal. It didn't need to be. What mattered was the pattern. Retaliatory contact, poorly justified, recorded by Brooks and corroborated by dashcam footage Hale had requested through a standard process the department seemed to have forgotten could be used against them. That's the line, Hale said quietly. They crossed it. Brooks forwarded the documentation to the federal office as a supplement, carefully labeled and time-stamped. He included no commentary, no accusations, just evidence. This time, the response came faster. A federal investigator requested a call. The conversation was brief and precise. The investigator asked about the diner, the report, the subsequent interactions. Brooks answered factually, offering documentation when requested. When asked about his background, Brooks paused, then provided a limited confirmation of his reserve status, emphasizing that it was not relevant to the facts at hand. The investigator agreed. It helps with jurisdiction, he said, but the behavior stands on its own. After the call ended, Brooks felt the shift. It wasn't relief, it was gravity. The matter had moved beyond preliminary interest. It had entered a phase where mistakes mattered. The local department sensed it too. Miller's tone changed again, this time toward irritation edged with anxiety. He filed another supplemental report, attempting to clarify earlier statements. In doing so, he contradicted a witness timeline already on record. The error was small, but cumulative. A supervisor intervened, attempting to smooth the language. In the process, he altered a quoted statement in a way that could be verified against an audio log. Hale caught it within hours. They're tripping over themselves, he said, and every step leaves a mark. The federal office issued a formal notice the following week. An active inquiry had been opened. Requests for records were attached. Deadlines were firm. The department responded publicly with confidence and privately with panic. Witnesses were contacted again, this time with a sense of urgency that bordered on coercion. One man recorded a voicemail he received and forwarded it to Brooks anonymously. The tone was unmistakable. Cooperation was expected. Silence would be remembered. That voicemail crossed a line no amount of internal review could erase. Brooks forwarded it to the federal investigator without comment. The reply came the next morning. Thank you. This is sufficient. Brooks closed his laptop and sat quietly for a long moment. The path forward was now irreversible. The inquiry was no longer about a punch or a report. It was about retaliation, about abuse of authority documented in real time. Outside, the town went about its business, unaware of how close it stood to a reckoning it had long avoided. Inside the department, doors closed, conversations lowered, and certainty evaporated. Brooks felt no satisfaction, only resolve. The slow turn had completed itself. What came next would not be quiet. The inquiry became real the morning two unmarked cars appeared outside the station and stayed there. No lights, no sirens, just presence. By noon, the rumor had spread through town that federal investigators were asking questions. Not the kind meant for headlines, but the kind that rearranged priorities behind closed doors. Brooks learned about it from Hale, who called with a single sentence. "They're in the building." That knowledge didn't bring relief, it brought consequence. Within hours, Brooks received a request for an in-person interview. The tone was different from before, direct, respectful, specific. He agreed and arrived early, carrying only a slim folder. He didn't need more. The record spoke for itself. The interview took place in a borrowed conference room at the municipal building, neutral ground chosen deliberately. Two investigators sat across from him, both calm, both attentive. They asked about the diner again, then moved carefully through the weeks that followed. Each question narrowed the frame. Each answer tightened it. When the topic turned to his background, Brooks gave only what was necessary. Active reserve, advisory capacity, bound by regulations that limited public comment. One investigator nodded, the other made a note. "We're not here because of who you are," the first said. "We're here because of what happened." Brooks appreciated the clarity. Across town, the department made its worst mistake. A supervisor authorized a late addition to the original incident file, attempting to reconcile conflicting timelines by inserting a clarifying memo. The memo referenced a conversation that never took place and cited a timestamp that contradicted dispatch logs already submitted to the federal office. It was an act born of urgency, not malice, and urgency was unforgiving. Hale spotted the inconsistency within minutes of receiving the updated file. He forwarded it to Brooks with a single word attached: fatal. Brooks sent it on without commentary. That afternoon, the waitress from the diner was contacted again. This time, the call was not subtle. The message was framed as concern, but the subtext was unmistakable. Cooperation would be remembered. So would silence. She recorded the voicemail and sent it anonymously to the same secure address Hale had given her weeks earlier. The recording was clear, the voice identifiable, the implication unambiguous. That line, once crossed, could not be uncrossed. The federal office responded within hours. A formal notice was issued requesting immediate preservation of all communications related to the incident. Devices, emails, call logs, no exceptions, no delays. The department complied publicly and panicked privately. Miller stopped returning calls. Supervisors argued behind closed doors. An internal email chain grew frantic, filled with questions no one wanted to answer. Who had authorized the memo? Who had contacted the witness? Who had approved the stop weeks earlier? No one volunteered ownership. Brooks felt the pressure spike in his own life as well. His reserve command requested a detailed briefing, this time not as inquiry, but as coordination. He provided it. The conversation was respectful but serious. He was reminded again of discretion, of limits, of the broader implications. "I understand," Brooks said. He always did. The difference now was that restraint no longer slowed the process. It sharpened it. When Brooks returned home that evening, he found an envelope taped to his door. Inside was a printed copy of a social media post accusing him of manufacturing allegations for attention. The account was anonymous, the language familiar. He photographed it, logged it, and threw it away. Hale called shortly after. "They're flailing," he said. "That's what this looks like." The next day, a formal letter arrived. The inquiry had been elevated from review to investigation. The wording was precise, unemotional, final. Brooks read it once and placed it in the folder. The point of no return had been reached. Federal agents interviewed witnesses again, this time with authority that could not be deflected. Statements were compared against recordings. Timelines were rebuilt from objective data rather than recollection. Each inconsistency tightened the net. Miller was placed on administrative leave. The announcement was brief, carefully worded, but the effect was immediate. Conversations stopped when he entered rooms. Doors closed more often than they opened. The confidence he once carried drained away, replaced by something brittle and defensive. A supervisor followed 2 days later. Brooks watched the news coverage from his living room, volume low. There was no triumph in it for him, only confirmation. The system, when pressed hard enough, revealed its seams. The investigators requested one final meeting with Brooks to clarify a detail related to the supplemental reports. He answered the question, provided the documentation, and asked none in return. When the meeting ended, one of them paused. "You did this the hard way," she said. Brooks nodded. "It was the only way I knew." That night, he slept deeply for the first time in weeks. The town woke the next morning to headlines that avoided sensationalism. Administrative actions, ongoing inquiry, commitment to transparency. The phrases were familiar, but the substance beneath them was not. Inside the department, the atmosphere was no longer defensive. It was cautious. Every decision now carried weight. Every action left a trail. Brooks felt the change in the smallest ways. The cruiser that once passed his house did not return. The stares in public softened into neutrality. The pressure receded, replaced by distance. It wasn't peace, not yet, but the direction had shifted. The system could no longer pretend this was an isolated misunderstanding. It had been forced to confront its own record, and in doing so, it had crossed into territory where outcomes were determined by evidence rather than loyalty. Brooks sat at his desk that evening, the folder open, pages neatly aligned. He didn't add anything new. There was nothing left to add. The truth was no longer waiting to be heard. It had entered the room, and once it did, there was no turning back. The consequences did not arrive with sirens or shouting. They came in envelopes, courtrooms, and quiet resignations that barely made the local paper. The investigation moved with deliberate force, grinding through months of records and testimony with a patience that felt relentless to those caught inside it. Brooks was interviewed again, this time under oath. The room was plain, the questions precise. He spoke without embellishment, answering only what was asked. Dates, words, actions. He described the diner, the punch, the report, the stops, the calls. When he was shown documents that contradicted earlier statements, he acknowledged them without commentary. The record spoke for itself. Miller's attorney attempted to frame the incident as a misunderstanding amplified by outside pressure. Brooks listened, hands folded, expression neutral. When asked why he hadn't reacted physically to the punch, he answered the same way he always had. "I chose not to escalate," he said. The simplicity of the statement carried more weight than any argument. Witnesses followed. The man by the window, the young couple, the waitress. Each told their version, halting at first, then steadier as timelines aligned and recordings filled the gaps memory could not. The voicemail was played aloud. The room went still as the words echoed off the walls. No one interrupted. Supervisors were called next. They explained procedures, policies, expectations. They spoke of discretion and trust. Then the investigators placed the memos on the table, the timestamps, the altered language, the sequence of approvals. The explanations grew thinner. By the third day, the pattern was undeniable. Miller was charged with assault and with filing a false report. The announcement was brief, the wording careful. He appeared once in public after that, standing beside his attorney, jaw set, eyes darting toward the cameras. He did not speak. He did not need to. The evidence had already done that for him. 2 supervisors were placed on leave pending review. One resigned quietly a week later, citing personal reasons. Another fought the process, insisting on his record, his years of service. The paper trail answered him more clearly than any press conference could. Brooks watched none of this unfold in person. He followed updates through official notices and short articles clipped from the news. He felt no satisfaction. The process was too slow, too heavy, too expensive in human cost for that. What he felt was a sober acknowledgement that truth, once documented, had momentum of its own. The hearings concluded without spectacle. Sentences were issued based on guidelines rather than outrage. Miller received a term that reflected both the assault and the attempt to conceal it. It was not the maximum. It was not symbolic. It was appropriate. The system for once matched its response to its findings. The department entered into a consent agreement that required oversight and reform. Training protocols were revised. Reporting structures adjusted. Community review expanded. None of it promised perfection. All of it acknowledged failure. Hale attended the final session from the back row. He did not speak. He did not need to. When it ended, he shook Brooks's hand once and left the building without looking back. His role, like so many others in the story, was finished. Brooks's reserve command reinstated his duties with conditions. He accepted them without complaint. His work would be quieter now, further from the public eye. That suited him. The attention had never been the point. The town reacted in pieces. Some defended the officers, some condemned them. Most moved on. Life resumed its routines, altered only by a faint awareness that accountability had reached places it rarely did. On his last day in town, Brooks returned to the diner. The booth where it had happened was occupied by a family laughing over pancakes. The waitress was gone. A new server poured his coffee and smiled without recognition. Brooks drank it slowly, savoring the ordinariness of the moment. Outside, the sun was bright and unremarkable. He paid his bill and left a generous tip. As he stepped onto the sidewalk, he felt the weight of the past months settle into something quieter, something resolved but not erased. Justice, he had learned, did not restore what was lost. It clarified what mattered. He drove out of town without ceremony, the road stretching ahead, familiar and open. The case would be cited in trainings and reports. His name would appear in footnotes and filings. None of that concerned him. What mattered was that the record now reflected reality, that the punch had been called what it was, that the silence had been broken carefully, deliberately, and at great cost. The consequences had come, not as vengeance, not as spectacle, but as accountability. And that, Brooks believed, was enough. Months later, the town looked the same to anyone passing through. The diner still opened before sunrise. The courthouse steps still gathered pigeons in the afternoon. Flags still lifted and fell in the same steady rhythm above storefronts that had survived longer than most memories. Change, when it came, had not announced itself. It had settled quietly into place. Brooks returned once, briefly, not to revisit the past, but to close a chapter properly. The department had new leadership now, faces unfamiliar and cautious. Policies were posted where no one had bothered to read them before. A community meeting was advertised on a bulletin board, handwritten and uneven, but sincere. None of it felt triumphant. It felt corrective. The officer who had replaced Miller at the morning shift kept his distance. Not out of fear, Brooks sensed, but respect mixed with uncertainty. Authority here had been reminded of its limits. That knowledge lingered in the air, subtle but unmistakable. The waitress had moved on. Brooks heard she was working in a different town, attending night classes again. No interview, no public praise, just a life put back on track after being knocked off it. Courage, Brooks had learned, rarely came with applause. Hale sent a short message a few weeks after the final hearing. "Take care of yourself. Don't let this define you." Brooks replied with a single word. "Understood." They did not speak again. Some alliances were meant to exist only as long as they were needed. Brooks resumed his reserve duties quietly, advising younger personnel who reminded him of himself years ago. He never told them about the diner. He didn't need to. When questions about restraint or judgment arose, he answered them with stories from training, from mistakes corrected early rather than late. The lesson carried without the context. At night, when things finally slowed, he sometimes thought about the moment after the punch, the silence, the collective pause. the knowledge shared by strangers that something had crossed a line. That moment had changed him, not by hardening him, but by clarifying what he was willing to endure and what he was not. Justice had not restored what he lost. His anonymity was gone. His routine had been disrupted. His family had carried worry they never asked for. Those costs did not disappear with verdicts or reforms. They simply became part of the ledger. But the record now reflected reality. That mattered. On his last morning in town, Brooks returned to the diner one final time. He chose a different booth, nearer the window this time. Sunlight spilled across the table, warm and unremarkable. He drank his coffee slowly, listening to the quiet hum of ordinary life continuing, just as it always had. A young black family entered and took a seat nearby. The parents laughed softly as their child struggled with a syrup bottle, sticky hands held up in surrender. The waitress brought extra napkins without being asked. No one stared. No one tensed. Brooks watched for a moment, then looked away, content. This, he thought, was what accountability was meant to protect. Not vengeance, not spectacle, just the simple right to exist without fear of arbitrary force. He paid his bill, left a tip, and stepped outside. The air was cool, the sky clear. He walked to his car without urgency, without looking over his shoulder. For the first time in a long while, he felt unguarded. The system had not been transformed overnight. It never was. But it had been forced to respond, to document, to correct. A line had been drawn, not by outrage, but by persistence. Not by shouting, but by record and restraint. Brooks drove away knowing he would carry this with him, not as a burden, but as a reminder. Silence could be powerful, but only when chosen freely. When imposed, it became something else entirely. Somewhere behind him, the town would continue its slow adjustment. New habits would form, old ones would resist. Progress would come unevenly, as it always did. But a precedent had been set, and precedents had a way of outlasting the people who created them. If this story made you pause, even briefly, consider why. Was it the punch, the process, or the patience it took to see things through? Share what stood out to you most. Stories like this only matter if we keep talking about them, examining where power meets responsibility and where restraint becomes strength. If you want to stay with stories that look past headlines and into consequences, stay here, subscribe, and keep the conversation going.